Situated on the edge of the Antarctic lies the spectacular island oasis of South Georgia. It's known as the Jewel of the Antarctic, a place of extraordinary natural beauty and wildlife. It's also a place where man once had a devastating presence. Recently, 4 artist adventurers sailed to South Georgia to explore this remarkable island and draw inspiration for their group art exhibition.
I did have apprehensions about a trip to South Georgia. The main was actually being with, in a confined space on a yacht for a month, with people I didn't know very well. So I did have apprehensions about that, and that was the thing that almost put me off. I thought, well, how am I going to manage that if you're in the middle of nowhere? You've got people that you sort of bump up against, and there's nothing you can do about it. But in the end, I decided that it wasn't about, it's not a love boat experience. I mean, we're not going there to sort of air the laundry.
South Georgia is a lone alpine island situated in the sub-Antarctic, over 1,000 kilometres from the Falkland Islands.
Once you're on the boat, it's always hard living anyway because you're in a confined space and you're a little boat on a big ocean. You can never truly relax or switch off because you're always rolling around. If you're in your bunk, you're rolling around. If you're up deck, you're getting tossed around as well. So when you're always travelling across the Southern Ocean, you're always prepared for the worst, really. It's one of those oceans that tends to throw up some quite wild seas, and you're always going to get hit by a weather system that's going to throw you around a bit and serve up the sort of the wave action and the wet weather sailing that you get to expect in this part of the world.
The trip on the sea was a trip in itself, just 4.5 days in confined conditions with people. So I was sort of a bit worried that I was sort of going to have conflict with people or go a bit stir crazy. But once we were sort of there on the boat, it was fine. I was probably more worried about being seasick more than anything else, or falling off the boat and into the water and dropping dead of exposure.
It's tough. I mean, even in a boat like that, you're rocking around, just trying to get out of your bunk is an awkward thing. The seasickness is always a problem for me. I thankfully didn't get too seasick. We had one really bad weather come through, and it was at night. The waves were pretty big, but it's part of the experience, and without that, it doesn't make the trip, I don't think, real. I remember when we first came across land at South Georgia, just the feeling, thank God there's land, and just to see it was just a monumental feeling inside.
My first impressions of the island, well, you're sort of excited because you're coming into such a foreign place, and after being at sea for 4 days, just to see land is an exhilarating experience and a relief.
My first view of South Georgia was this mist-ridden line of mountains, snow-clad, not unlike peaks you might find in Europe, but the fact that you're approaching them from, for after 4 days at sea, and it's just this line for stretching as far as you could see of this island was just magical, absolutely magical.
First impressions of South Georgia is this incredibly expansive mountain range that bursts up out of the water with glaciers streaming down to the water's edge. The island itself is only 170 kilometres long and about 40 at its widest. So it's got a small island right in the middle of this Southern Ocean.
Once we're at South Georgia, the idea was that we'd explore the length of the island on the northwest side. We'd track pretty close to the coast and find appropriate moorings. Each way we entered a sheltered cove was different, some through very narrow passes and passages. Those sort of things became pretty exciting at the time because everyone would be up on deck at that stage when we're about to find a new place to stay for the day or for the night. Once you get out into the wilds of South Georgia, it's a remote location.
A lot of the landings that we had, you couldn't anchor at. So we'd often travel from the anchorage to the beaches and then spend the day ashore, and then the boat would come back and pick us up.
And even just walking up the mountains, that was always fantastic because you're always walking into different environments. You'd be walking through tussock grass, dodging seals, and then you'd come up into snow-covered country, rocks, mosses, and the mosses were always amazing just because there was, you know, they were 300 or 400 year old, these moss beds, and they were a metre thick.
An amazing variance of wildlife from the king penguins right through to the seals that breed on the island, and also the bird life that actually flies above that. It's an incredibly rich environment in that regard. Some of these penguin rookeries themselves are 20 to 30,000 penguins in one particular rookery. So these are incredible numbers of wildlife.
It was fascinating watching penguins work with each other in a sort of comical manner, and then you had the skuas coming down and ripping apart a dead seal, and just how they did that and guarded their little area. The fur seals guarding their own little plot of sand on the beaches or rocks on the beaches.
Number of seal colonies that we saw, a number of bird colonies at breeding time. There was just an amazing proliferation of wildlife. It's like the drama of their existence in a harsh environment, and then there's also the drama of the landscape itself, which was essentially black and white as I saw it, or as I came away thinking about it. We've got the areas of snow drifts against this very stark landscape.
The South Georgia environment is extremes. One minute you'll be in a nice sunny day, and then half an hour later it'll turn on you and you get blasted with katabatic winds that come out of the mountains. And you just sit back and really experience these wild extremes of a place like this, and you get to really respect and admire what nature can actually serve up to you.
We're walking along and looking at glaciers and penguins and various things, and you can feel the weather starting to pick up a little bit and the wind starting to pick up, and that can happen with those katabatic winds coming down, which are very strong. But it seemed within 10 or 15 minutes, the world had just caved in on us. We sort of got to the beach and you could see the boat bouncing out on the water, and once we radioed Australis, it was made clear that, look, we can't get the Zodiacs to the beach, so just wait and it'll change. And I remember all huddling in this little bunch, and as we were really getting cold, our feet and hands were, because you weren't moving around and you're being just hit by the wind, and you're trying to nestle in these tussock grasses, thinking, gee, this is terrible, boy, it's good too. This is what it should be like in a way. And then you look around and you see all these penguins just standing there as if it was a sunny day to them and being sandblasted. It was quite an event. I remember then getting on the boat and telling Roger, the skipper, that was, thank God, thanks for organising that for us. And suddenly you're in a bay and you're sheltered and everything's fine again. And it was, again, part of the trip. It was what made it, South Georgia, so interesting. I was impressed by the fact that man had somehow got all this stuff down there, all this wood and metal and generators and motors and everything. I just kept looking around and thinking, how did all this get here?
In this industry, they literally built small towns on the island. You know, there was cinemas and there was churches and all of this to make life a little bit easier for the workers who had to work, you know, continually all season, 24 hours a day.
The whole place was sort of permeated with this sort of old echo, you could imagine, of the noise and the reverberation of humanity there. And it still had the feel of that, but it was more like a ghost town. The soul of the place had the feel of what it was like, and yet it was completely empty. You know, it echoed of man's industry.
Man's sort of impact on the environment was during the early 1900s. They literally set up South Georgia as the central whaling area. There was not only one of these, but there was like 4 or 5 of them along the island. Emotionally, it is quite haunting to be amongst all this whaling industry and the blood and everything that must have been throughout all these harbours and bays. The amount of whales taken in one particular season, up to 5,000, and the visualising of how these harpoons and things which still lie on the shoreline.
I think whales have long memories, and they're nowhere to be seen down at South Georgia, which once upon a time I suspect would have been a haven for them, and we didn't see one whale. And I don't blame them. The whaling stations over the life of them took hundreds of thousands of whales out of the water just to light the street lamps of Europe and London. The whaling stations meant destruction and death, and that's the sadness of South Georgia.
Even then, when the whaling stations had finished, they thought that the whales would come back, so they left the whaling stations fully equipped with boats, machinery, everything was left for the time that when the whales did come back, that they could start harvesting again. But as yet, after 50 years, the whales have never come back. They're still completely depleted.
Man's imprint there, that these buildings and these whale tanks, has morphed again back in the landscape. So it's not such a horrible sight as you might expect it to be. And I think because the buildings were an older style building, there's a romanticism about them. My art was inspired by a few things, and it went through stages. Initially, I thought, I'm going to get onto the bird life here. This is something that I've noticed. Then the amount of waterfall streams that were coming down from the higher peaks, I found visually fascinating, and started going and doing most of my drawings when I was down there were on these streams. But towards the end, I think the thing that really got me going was all these man-made structures that were in these hostile environment, and in some cases had become very much a part of the landscape because they had decayed or rotted away. And so I quite enjoyed this idea of the building. The building also was a church at Griffin, the whale tanks, and I just found the idea of the refuge hut or the red hut interesting, that there was this one little minute building that represented man in a sense, with this colossal landscape behind it. And it gave scale to what you were seeing. It also, in a sense, represented man, that what the hell was this little red building doing there, and often what was man doing there. What was nice, you'd be sitting on the boat looking at this landscape one day, and then that night it would snow, and the next day it was all covered in white. What was handy often, I'd painted it that day and got that shape of the landscape with the tussock grasses and creeks, and then when it snowed I had an understanding what was underneath it. What I've done since then is come back to the studio and develop some of those drawings and photographs into oil on canvas paintings.
The effect of South Georgia on me was the wildlife and the landscape. The incredible experience of being with the wildlife, being in amongst it and experiencing their movements and their character. To be with them for hours on end was an incredible experience, and is what I really strongly came away with was the love of nature, and hopefully that comes through in my photography. With my photography, I tend to start often with the broad landscape, and I try and compose that in a way that is pleasing, I guess, to myself visually to start with. And then I usually come into a point where I find myself in these incredible details within that landscape. They might be mosses or lichen or rock formations or simple snow effect on grass in the landscape. And so I'm trying to record in a low impact way of how spectacular and beautiful these parts of the world are, and they're just a magic part of the world.
I think it was the glaciers that probably had the biggest impact. I'd never stood in front of a glacier before or been that close to one. And they are truly awesome. I mean, they'd be 10 stories high, some of them. And just the idea that there are 1,000 years of snow somehow slowly carving their way down through valleys between mountains somehow had a prehistoric, and there was a sense about them that they were still living. You could hear them cracking deep within inside them, the range of colours that you could find in the compressed snow. And just the awesome quality of the glaciers is something that really struck me. What inspired the work that I produced about South Georgia was the drama of the landscape, the drama of, I suppose, within the environment, that proliferation of wildlife. Usually when I'm out in the environment, I'm photographing and drawing directly into a pad and trying to, in a sense, just observe the environment as much as I can. The point being that the more observations I can make, the more sits within me for things that might filter through the work when I'm making it back in the studio. The thing about birds that fascinates me is something I can't really put my finger on. It's just been an abiding interest since I was a child. In many ways, I don't really want to try and divine that too much. It's just a fascination that has a kind of childlike quality about it, has a mystery about it. It's difficult because it can become illustrative, but it also can, for me, signify a location really quite powerfully. And no matter where I travel, I try and observe the birds of that particular region.
The nature of being on a boat and producing art, you're fairly limited, and especially in a cold climate, you have to think of things that'll dry or that won't freeze up. So I was basically using contes and pastels, a bit of oil, stick. You just sort of, go out with a pencil, sketch on, add some colour, fill in to a certain extent so you don't overwork the picture, and then sort of giving it a rest. I'd come back and rework on it on the boat, and then just, sort of slowly build up the atmosphere to create that sort of the feeling that I want to get and the ambience I want to get. I was sort of interested in the contrast of the rust and the industrialness against this sort of snow white, sort of pristine natural environment covered in bird life and animal life. And it's all those sort of aspects that then sort of recreate into my work further down the track.
Regardless of what those whaling stations stood for, what they were actually engaged with, there's no end of interest and kind of aesthetic beauty in something that's so decaying as a whaling station. What's actually happening now is slowly but surely nature's sort of overtaking and somehow redeeming the pristine environment.
With the whaling stations, it was quite interesting that nature had actually started to reclaim them. So, there's a great experience there of a whole evolution of things that have gone on, a lot of sad things, a lot of sort of, hopeful things. That was the one good thing about the trip in a funny sort of way. It reaffirmed me that nature can make a comeback, reclaim itself and repair itself if given the time to do so.
The exhibition that we had gave the whole expedition a kind of significance that I don't think would have happened if we just had have done the trip, maybe worked down there and just went our own ways. It became an important part of the whole trip, you know, so it wasn't just finished when we hopped off the boat at the end of our trip to South Georgia.